Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette. Time appropriate greetings. Looks like a nice day here in New York today. Okay, so we're looking at some philosophy papers. Let's see, we did some Asian philosophy the other day and also some Wittgenstein. And so we're just back to the list of recently released stuff. Australian Philosophical Review. Childhood and Philosophy. Let's take a look. So we got 15 pages there. It's a little bit... that's it. I don't want to do something... 15 pages is really the limit of what I want to read at the moment, because if it gets longer than that, it becomes it becomes a long section. I'm reading for like over an hour almost. But we'll see. Depends on the day. I saw the complexity stuff. Economics and philosophy? Hey, why not? Let's take a look at what they have. Maybe there's something to read. I fear, of course, there is a... Review. Which value should be built into economic measures? To maximize profit or not to maximize profit? For firms, this is a valid question. Well, let's take a look. This is another 15 pages. These are long essays. Let's take a look quickly. If it is as long as I fear it is, I'm going to just run away because I'm afraid. Yeah, 23. Although it is double spaced. See if there's a billion references. It cuts down on the page count. No, they're tightly wrapped references. What do I care? Here we go then. Which value should be built in economic measures? S. Andrew Schroeder. Nope. Give it a shot. I'll read fast. If you're in the live chat, you can type exclamation point paper and you'll get the link will pop back up in the notes if you're not here at this second. Okay. So. Cool. Okay, no abstract, not abstracting. Alright, which value should be built into economic measures? S. Andrew Schroeder. Okay. Values in economic measures, 3 positions. It is well known that many economic measures are structured to reflect social, ethical, or political values, or have such values built into them. For example, take the unemployment rate, which is unbelievable at the moment in the United States. It doesn't even make sense. As standardly calculated in the United States, a number of groups are excluded from the calculation, counting as neither employed nor unemployed, those younger than 16, those not actively looking for work, those in prison, and residents of certain healthcare facilities. Many of these individuals have clear unemployment status, so there is no technical reason for their exclusion. It seems more likely that this is, in at least some of these cases, the exclusion is based on the ethical judgment, whether correct or not, that members of these groups in some sense don't deserve jobs or have no claim on society to provide them with jobs. I suspect, for example, that many people think that those younger than 16 in general ought not to work and therefore can have no claim on society for a job, that incarcerated individuals have forfeited any claim to a job for the duration of their incarceration, and that it is so challenging to find a job for full-time residents of healthcare facilities that society has no obligation to provide employment. Similar claims could be made about how many economic measures, including GDP, price indices, and health Economic measures such as quality-adjusted and disability-adjusted life years, QALYs and dailies, are structured to reflect ethical or political values. What should we think about adjusting or structuring measures for such ethical reasons? There has been a fair amount of discussion on narrow questions about specific value choices that structure or could structure measures. There has been debate, for example, about whether incarcerated individuals really should be excluded from unemployment calculations, about whether QALYs should give less weight to infant deaths, quality adjustments, life years, quality adjusted life years. Give less weight to infant deaths, and whether luxury goods should be excluded from price indices. Oftentimes, this debate proceeds by directly evaluating the ethical issue at stake. Have prisoners really forfeited any claim to a job? Are infant deaths morally less significant than adolescent deaths? But it seems to me that before engaging with these narrow questions, we must first address a set of broader questions which may render the narrower ones irrelevant. Should the unemployment rate even be adjusted for differential claims to jobs in the first place? Should a putative measure of health like the QALY even try to reflect the moral significance of different types of health losses? These broader questions have received less explicit attention. One way to reject these broader questions would be to argue that they don't really make sense, since any choice we make will reflect some ethical value or other. Just as giving weight to infant deaths in QALY calculations would reflect the view that infant lives are less important than adolescent lives, assigning them equal weight would reflect the view that they are of equal importance. Elsewhere, I explain why I reject this view. Although there may be a sense in which all measures are thoroughly infused with values, there is a distinct and important sense in which choosing to discount infant lives for ethical reasons involves values in a way simply weighing them equally does not. In other words, it is possible for a health economist to calculate mortality statistics while remaining agnostic on the relative moral importance of infant versus adolescent lives. In this essay, I will take for granted that this is correct, that there is an important sense in which some choices, including those mentioned earlier, render an economic measure value-laden in ways it otherwise needn't be. I think this is the standard view amongst economists, and in any case, it is presupposed by the authors I will go on to discuss. Okay, so you have to, the movie was about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the case where she started the gender discrimination. It was about tax law, and they were like, you can make a challenge about discrimination on the taxes? Well, yeah, because the way you value economics, it does reflect the moral and ethical values of the society, like what needs to get paid for, what does not get paid for, what is deserving of help. So, we'll see. So we have to, how that's broken up, of course, makes a difference, but this is a very interesting point, how exactly we understand economic measure to be value-laden. Okay. Given then that economists at least sometimes have a choice about whether to adjust measures to reflect ethical value, we can identify three broad stances one could take towards doing so, each of which has some support among economists and philosophers of economics. First, we can imagine a maximalist position, according to which ideally every value relevant to the associated policy decision should be built into an economic measure. If, for example, policymakers are called upon to maximize unemployment among those who claim to jobs, among those with claims to jobs, then they should be provided with unemployment data that excludes those without claim to jobs. And if health ministers should give more weight to adolescent deaths than to infant deaths, QALY calculations should be weighted accordingly. Alan Williams offers a defense of a view like this. If the nature and implications of particular positions are to be clarified in a policy-relevant way, this discussion has to move on to seek quantification of what are otherwise merely vague, appealing, but ambiguous ethical slogans. Only with some quantification will it be possible to devise rules that can be applied in a consistent manner with a reasonable chance of checking on performance. Yeah. Well, who counts as an infant and not an infant? There's a line to be drawn there, and then you have to quantify how many people fall under that line. So, Though a number of economists appear to endorse maximalism or hold views substantially to it, it is not very popular. Yeah, well, quantifying everything is extremely difficult. You just can't go through every last thing. You have to sort of use rules of thumb, mostly. Much more popular has been what I call minimalism. In some cases, it may not be possible to avoid value judgments when structuring a measure. You're not going to avoid value judgments. Calculating any sort of unemployment rate, for example, requires determining what counts as employment, and this will involve value judgments. Is someone who works 1 hour a week employed? What about an intern who receives a parking subsidy but no other material compensation? But the minimalist says we should structure our measures to reflect value judgments only when necessary. Whenever possible, we should keep ethical values out of economic measures. That seems very naive, frankly. You're not keeping ethical values out. I mean, people want their subject to be their economics to be objective, but that never works out. So, economic measures are all right here. Economic measures, after all, are supposed to be scientific, and scientific measures are supposed to be value free. Yeah, no. It would seem incredibly odd to adjust other scientific measures to reflect ethical considerations to exclude or discount voluntary informed smokers from lung cancer statistics, for example, on the grounds that their illness should be a lower public health priority. I bet that sort of stuff happens. Similarly, perhaps we should, maybe it shouldn't happen, but yeah. Similarly, perhaps we should let the unemployment rate simply measure unemployment and Quayle simply measure health. Judgment about whose unemployment matters or about whose health problems are of greater social concern should be left to a policymakers, not made by economists. Christopher Murray and colleagues seem to endorse a minimalist view when they suggest that daily should be viewed as a strict summary measure of population health, and therefore not adjusted to account for certain ethical factors. And the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics insists that its table must satisfy a number of criteria, including impartiality in both subject matter and presentation. I mean, I think the real problem here with that is that it's completely subject to historical factors. You're basically measuring what you measured in the past, what you already have data for, and you're assuming that the old data isn't value laden in the way that you think that any changes to the data is. The fact that this is the data we have reflected the values of whenever someone put the time and effort in to get that that quantification set up to begin with. And so you're basically importing the values of the past. And so, if anything, just this minimalism seems completely wrong-headed in its defense here. You think you're being objective? No, you're importing the terrible, usually things from the past that we. Well, not always terrible. Maybe the fact that they've got health statistics is excellent, but which ones matter which ones we have depended on which ones they thought were important in the past. So, okay. So, having laid out the two extreme positions, we are left with a collection of intermediate views, which hold that some but not all policy-relevant values should be built into economic measures. Any proponent of intermediate view, however, faces an obvious question. If some but not all policy-relevant values are to be built into a given measure, how should economists decide which values to build in and which to leave out? Though in practice, intermediate views seem to be fairly common, economists rarely give an explicit answer to this question. Murray, however, offers a proposal which I think is consistent with many economists' practices. Many individuals, after deliberation, hold a preference or value that if many individuals after deliberation hold a preference or value, then this value should be considered seriously. We should investigate the likely reasons why many individuals hold such a view. If these reasons appear to be persuasive and do not contravene important ideal regarding principles, these principles should be incorporated into the construction of dailies. Murray seems to be proposing two criteria. A policy-relevant value should be incorporated into the daily if and only if that value, 1, is widely held among those who have reflected on it, and 2, can be supported by good reasoning, or at least does not conflict with important moral principles. Yeah, this is the sort of Humean take on things, think hard and look at what it does. We could somewhat loosely sum up this by saying that Murray wants to build uncontroversial views and only uncontroversial views into the daily and presumably other economic measures. This, I think, seems like a sensible view, which tries to accommodate the insights lying behind both maximalism and minimalism. In permitting some values to be built in, this view accepts the maximal the maximal insight that quantifying policy relevant values and building them into our measures will enable policymakers to more effectively pursue their goals. But in restricting those values to uncontroversial ones, the economist doesn't seem to be stepping beyond her expertise in any significant way or usurping the role of the policymaker. After all, the only values being built in are ones that are subject of general agreement, which can be supported by good reason. Yeah, small cough. Nevertheless, I think Murray's view is mistaken. In the succeeding sessions, I'll argue by way of case study that Murray's proposal fails because it looks at only properties of the value choices itself, how widely held it is, and what substantive reasons support it, while failing to look at the way in which the value is built into the measure. Some value choices are built into measures in what I will call fixed ways, while others are called user accessible. I will argue that economists generally have stronger reasons to build fixed value choices into a measure, even if they're only more controversial than a user-accessible value choices. In the end, I will suggest that while Murray was probably right to endorse an intermediate view over maximalism or minimalism, an adequate version of the intermediate view will be much more complicated than Murray's proposal. I will conclude briefly by weighing in on the ongoing debate about whether measures of health should standardly be adjusted for accounts for inequality, arguing that they should. Okay. These sorts of intermediate, like the sort of like be reasonable and when there's like wide agreement, go for that. These sorts of views are of course what like happens in practice. They don't tend to work theoretically because they're just relying on people's common sense, which is fine. I mean, that's basically what you're going to end up doing one way or the other. But as far as theoretical proposals, they don't seem to last, really. I mean, the idea to use people's common sense to like look at what works and look at what's widely accepted and like be rational about it, that's very good. But you're not going to get specifics out of it that are the specifics can never be will never be as commonsensical as the common sense at the time, like the proposal to use common sense. So anything that you do at that time and place will be just what is available to you in some sense. Again, historically contingent. Okay, case studies. Values in the dailies. Dailies, a relative of Quailies, are a composite measure of morbidity and mortality designed to measure the amount of health lost to a particular cause or event. The most prominent use is the main outcome measure in the influential Global Burden of Disease study, of which Christopher Murray is one of the lead authors. Though the calculation of daily is complicated, for our purposes we only need to look at the mortality component, which is fairly straightforward. The health loss attributed to a premature death is calculated based on the years of life lost to that death. Suppose in a country where life expectancy at birth is stable at 80, a car accident kills a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old. The car accident took roughly 50 and 40 years of life from its victims, respectively, and so 50 plus 40 equals 90 dailies would be attributed to the accident. Historically, however, many epidemiologists and economists using dailies have not been content to rest there. The dailies resulted from some event have typically been adjusted to reflect various ethical values. In the remainder of this section, I will discuss 3 of those value choices, see what they can tell us about the intermediate view Murray endorses. The first value choice is that involved in age weighting. Most people believe that each year of life is not of equal value from a political or ethical perspective. A surgery that would extend the life of a young adult by 2 years should be a higher policy priority than one extends the life of an infant by 2 years. And most people, if forced to choose, prefer to save the life of a teenager before saving the life of an infant, despite the fact that the infant likely has more years left to live. Murray, in an article explaining the methodology behind the dailies, accepts a version of this argument. The well-being of some age groups, we argue, is instrumental in making society flourish. Therefore, collectively, we may be more concerned with improving health status for individuals in these age groups. On the basis of empirical investigations of age preferences among the public, the original daily assigned extra weight to health losses between the ages of 9 and 54, reduced weight to the health losses outside of that range. Many have criticized this value judgment, some arguing that different age weights should be considered, others arguing that no age weights should be used. Murray and colleagues eventually accepted these concerns, and in recent updates to the Global Burden of Disease study have abandoned the use of unequal age weights. Second, consider the standard economic practices of discounting. In economic calculations, the value of future costs and benefits is typically discounted by a small percentage each year. Most daily calculations treat health in the same way, discounting the value of future health. So a death averted this year counts for more than an otherwise similar death averted next year. Although a variety of arguments have been offered for discounting, Murray chose an explicit ethical one for the construction of dailies. In the construction of dailies, I have struggled with two options: to use a low positive discount rate to capture the uncertainty that increases with time, and, more importantly, to reduce the problem of excessive sacrifice. As with previous versions of the study, the baseline daily measure incorporates a 3% discount rate. And the problems of excessive sacrifice. As with age weighting, the practice of discounting has been incredibly controversial, and in the most recent iteration of the Global Burden of Disease study, Murray has abandoned it, though dailies are discounted in many other studies. A third ethical value built into the daily is connected to the way it handles life expectancy. To calculate the years of life lost to a premature death, we need to assign a life expectancy to the victim. The most obvious and natural way is to ask of the victim how many more years she would have lived had she not died of the cause in question. Call this a counterfactual approach to life expectancy, CLE. Murray, however, points out a problem with CLE. Suppose two 40-year-olds, one in Kigali and the other in Paris, die in car accidents. Using CLE would lead us to conclude that the death of a 40-year-old woman in Kigali contributes less to the global burden of disease than the death of a 40-year-old woman in Paris, because the expectation of life at 40 is lower in Rwanda than in France. Equivalent health outcomes would be a greater burden in richer communities than in poorer communities. This seems unfair. Consider populations are already disadvantaged by low expectancy, and then deaths in those populations register fewer dailies because of that disadvantage. When measuring the burden of disease on population, it seems perverse to count the death for less because the victim would otherwise have died of another health problem shortly thereafter, compounding being poor, which happens a lot. What then should we do? Murray proposes that we apply the same life expectancy to all deaths at a given age anywhere in the world, making the death of every 40-year-old woman count the same regardless of her personal characteristics. This is clearly a value choice. This proposal was adopted because the apparent value-free route to simply count how many years we were actually lost due to the death yielded by Murray's lights yielded morally unacceptable results. Murray applies the same life expectancy to all deaths, not because all people do live to roughly the same age, but because he believes they should. Put another way, the daily does not measure how many more years a victim would have lived. It measures how many more years she should have lived. Call this an aspirational approach to life expectancy. ALE. Oh, I like ALEs. Murray explicitly says that he chose to use ALE because of its egalitarian nature. A dimension we can highlight by noting that calculating daily using ALE is equivalent to calculating them using CLE, while giving extra weight to years of life lost by those disadvantaged with low life expectancy. Unlike age weighting and discounting, well, you know what I would have done? I mean, there's the flip side of this, is that you can also, depending on how old people are expected to live to, if that's below if you're taking like an average, then some people in certain countries, like with a very high life expectancy, they're getting like free years at the end that they don't deserve compared to everybody else. So you're discounting their extra years as opposed to giving extra weight to the unfortunate folks with low life expectancy, giving extra weight to the people with low life expectancy. Okay, anywho. Unlike age weighting and discounting, the use of aspiral life expectancy has been almost entirely uncontroversial. As far as I can tell, since Murray's original discussion, there has been only one short book chapter dedicated to discussing of the life expectancy chosen for the daily, in contrast to a large number of articles written about age weighting and nearly limitless number on discounting. Few articles do note the use of aspirational life expectancy, but most either don't recognize it as a value choice or else endorse the value choice. Not surprisingly, current versions of the Global Burden of Disease study continue to incorporate a version of aspirational life expectancy. If age weighting and discounting have been so controversial, why has Murray's choice to use an ethically loaded conception of life expectancy largely escaped criticism? There are several possible explanations. Perhaps the substantive ethical arguments in favor of aspirational life expectancy are stronger than the arguments for age weighting and discounting. Perhaps those ethical beliefs are more widely accepted among philosophers, policymakers, and economists. Or perhaps authors simply haven't noticed the value choice involved in use of aspirational life expectancy. These explanations may be part of the truth, but I think another factor may also be at work, one that would not merely explain the differential treatment, but would also justify it. Haley will find out. Suppose you are a policymaker and are given the unage-weighted dailies attributed to 2 diseases, but you think that health losses at different ages should be of different social concern. What information would you need to produce an estimate of age-weighted dailies? You would need 1, a breakdown of ages at which dailies were lost, and 2, your preferred age weighting function. On most age weighting proposals, 2 is relatively simple, and the information needed for 1 can often be readily estimated by policymakers because the age profiles of many diseases are relatively constant and widely known. Malaria primarily kills the very young. Strokes mostly occur in elderly. U.S. cardiacs and fatalities strike at all ages, with relative spikes among young adults and the elderly, etc. And even if 1 isn't previously known to policymakers, that breakdown is often published in a study like the Global Burden of Disease study. What all this means is that given unage-weighted results, a moderately sophisticated policymaker can usually produce a reasonable estimate of what age-weighted results would look like without needing to access the raw data. Much of the same, I think, can be said about discounting. Call value choices like this, which can be adjusted for after the fact by decision makers, user accessible. Okay, now compare that to the case of life expectancy. Suppose you were given dailies calculated using counterfactual life expectancy, but moved by Murray's arguments, you would prefer to base your policy decisions on dailies calculated using aspirational life expectancy. What information do you need? Life expectancy varies significantly by age, gender, and geography, among other factors, so at minimum you need dailies to break down along those dimensions. Then you need data on actual life expectancy for each age, gender, geography, triple, so that you can determine the difference between the CLA used in the results you were given and the ALE you prefer. These differences are not always as predictable as one might suspect. For example, although richer countries typically have higher life expectancies than poorer countries, there are plenty of outliers. Adjusting life expectancy from CLE to ALE or vice versa therefore requires much more data, essentially the unaggregated data, as well as much more complex calculation. The value judgments around life expectancy therefore seem much harder for a user to implement on her own compared to those connected to age weighting or discounting. Call value choices which can't realistically be applied by a user to a summary measure, for example due to high information requirements or computational complexity, fixed value choices. As further evidence that the values in the daily connected to age and time are much more easily user accessible than those connected to life expectancy, consider a well-known 2004 article in Health Policy by Trude Arneson and Lydia Capariri. Arneson and Capariri set out to determine to what extent the final results in the Global Burden of Disease study were sensitive to the value judgments built into the daily. Concerning age weighting and discounting, they ultimately showed that those value choices have a decisive impact on the relative distribution of the burden between age groups. However, they add, we were not able to assess the effect of alternative life expectancies. We would then have needed to access the details in the epidemiological information, as well as life tables with hypothetical life expectancies, in addition to life tables based on observations. True trained specialists and attempting to assess the impact of value choices on a major study found it relatively easy to recalculate dailies with alternative age weighting and discounting functions, but were unable to do the same for life expectancy. That suggested that even a relatively sophisticated policymaker is going to have trouble taking dailies, calculating using CLE, and adjusting them to ALE, or to the or reverse, without significant amount of time and expert assistance, as well as access to the unaggregated data. Well, you got to think that these measures are all sort of interrelated, so it's going to, you can't just, the life expectancy is going to depend on all the other factors sort of combined. So because it's a total sort of thing that adds up all the other like early deaths and stuff built in, that they're interrelated, and that will make it massively complex to figure out, because to get any sort of objective measure, because the whole point of the life expectancy is that it takes into account everything that happened in life up until a point on average of everybody. So that means that all the other information, in some sense, the life expectancy depends on all the other data. Which in some sense, if you're just looking at a particular thing that happens to like an infant death versus an adolescent death, then you're only looking at a very small slice of all the data over everybody. Okay. The importance of user accessibility. The distinction between relatively user accessible and relatively fixed value choices is a crucial one ethically. As we saw above, one of the main factors motivating minimalism is the view that value judgment should be made by policymakers, not scientists. Not sure we should be doing that, but okay. With user-accessible value choices like age weighting and discounting, this distinction is tenable. It is at least potentially reasonable for an economist to say, we presented you with an unage-weighted results. If you believe health losses at different ages of different social concern, then adjust these results to reflect your values before making policy decision. But with fixed value choices, the same division of labor doesn't work. An economist cannot say, we presented you with CLE-based results, apply whatever conception of life expectancy you deem appropriate. The policymaker will be unable to adjust the resulting measure. What this means is that for values like life expectancy, the policymaker will be forced to base her policy decisions on whatever form of the measure she is given by the economist. In making a choice about whether to use counterfactual or aspirational life expectancy, the economist is, for practical purposes, deciding which value choice will be embodied in policy decisions. Another way to think about this is to focus on the role a scientist is supposed to play in policy making. Many scientific bodies take their goal to be to provide relevant information to decision makers or to facilitate informed decision making by policy makers. Philosophers of science have argued for this view, and it coheres with the way many scientists understand their own roles. Now, it might seem that this picture supports minimalism. If a scientist's goal is to provide information but not to influence values, then it seems natural to think that the best way to do this is to provide information that is value-free as possible, since it is the policymaker who should supply the values. With user-accessible values like those connected to age weighting, this may be correct. Unage-weighted dailies can directly inform a policymaker's decision to minimize total health loss irrespective of age. And they can also indirectly inform a policymaker's decision to minimize health loss while giving greater weight to young adults, since the policymakers can estimate age-weighted dailies from unage-weighted dailies. But this stance doesn't work with fixed values. CLE-based dailies can provide relevant information to policymakers who seeks to minimize life years lost in her population, but they can't in any clear way inform the decision of a policymaker who wants to make decisions in a way that doesn't disadvantage groups with low age specific life expectancy. And conversely, age-based dailies can inform the latter decision, but aren't very useful for the former. Thus, if an economist takes her goal to provide relevant information to policymakers or to promote informed decision-making by policymakers, she simply can't default to CLE on the grounds that, in representing actual life expectancy, CLE is value-free. Economists cannot reasonably remain agnostic or neutral concerning fixed value choices. In such cases, whatever decision they make will dictate or at least significantly constrain the values which influence downstream policy decisions. This means that a positive choice between CLE, ALE, and whatever other options there are must be made and is ethically loaded in a way that the choice not to age weight or not to discount would not be. Funny end of a sentence. Load away that. Yeah, okay. All of this suggests the following principle. If values of type A cannot easily be adjusted for after the fact by decision makers in some measure M, that is, A values are fixed for M, there's strong reason for economists to structure M to reflect their preferred position on A, even if they are uncertain about what views A are widely held and or the correct view on A. If this principle is correct, then minimalism is false, as is Murray's version of the intermediate view. Though I haven't offered an argument for it here, I think those of us who are sympathetic towards the minimalist preference for a division of labor between economists and policymakers can comfortably endorse the following parallel principle. If values of type B can easily be adjusted for after the fact by decision makers in some measure, M, that is B values are user accessible for M, at least in many cases, there is reason for the economists to adopt a value-neutral position on B and M, even if they are relatively confident about what views on B are widely held and or about the correct view on B. If this principle is correct, then maximalism is also false. Thus, the correct view to take on values in economic measures will be a version of the intermediate view other than Murray's. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense. Like I was saying earlier, this first principle that was outlined here, you're not going to get away from the value judgments, and so you have to assume, you're not going to get rid of them, so just saying that there's some sort of objective way of doing it, that's what this first principle is saying, and so you can't get out of that, and so any general philosophy based on the idea that you're being objective is just not going to work all the time. It may work sometimes, but that's what the second principle says. In the cases where you can be you can present a sort of range of views, and then you can sort of say, well, different ethical positions fall within this range. You should do that in those cases, because then you stick to your, you stay in your lane, as it were. Like the economists can do their economy, and the politics can do their policy. Okay. Before reflecting on the importance of this result, let me close this section by clarifying one point and responding to an obvious and important objection. First, the clarification. The above principle suggests that when structuring measure, economists need to, why did I bother spelling it out if he was going to do it? Economists need to, 1, think about which policy relevant values will end up being fixed via user accessible in the resulting measure, and 2, for fixed values, need to substantially engage with them, making a positive determination. But thus far, I've not said anything about how they should make that determination. There are many options. For example, economists could seek to determine, perhaps through empirical study, what position has plurality support among the decision makers likely to use the study, or among the populations that will be affected by the associated policy decisions. Or they could engage in substantive normative reasoning to try to determine the position on the issue most likely to be objectively correct, or at least likely to lead to rights violations. You see, this is the sort of the ethics board area right here. So when you are a scientist, you have to usually justify that you're not doing anything ethically questionable in your studies. But the problem is that the setup of the studies to begin with, even if you're not doing something ethically questionable, there are ethics questions that happen at the get-go, even before any sort of science happens. And so this is really where the ethics needs to be really understood to set this up, because of these normative reasoning things here. And there's no guarantee that whoever, an economist, is going to be able to determine the position most likely to be correct. I mean, that's, again, go get yourself an ethicist. Don't get yourself an economist at that point. Okay, or we could give an economist free choice to adopt their own preferred positions. Yeah, the willy-nilly, do it willy-nilly, yeah, just go study whatever you think's interesting, which is fine too, but it may not be useful for policy, etc. Which of these approaches is appropriate is a difficult, important, and probably context-sensitive issue, but in this paper I will take no stand on it. The point is that all these require substantive engagement with the issue rather than a retreat to a supposedly neutral position. Second, the objection. There is one natural way to seek to lessen the importance of fixed versus user accessible values and to avoid having to address the issue I discussed in the previous paragraph. If users will be unable to translate between dailies calculating using CLE and dailies calculating using ALE, The obvious solution is to provide them with both. This can be done in a traditional way via, for example, two sets of results in a printed paper, or in a more dynamic way, an online tool which can recalculate results based on a user's preferred values. A similar motivation lies behind dashboard type approaches, where distinct components that measure otherwise be aggregated into a summary measure are presented separately to allow users to aggregate them in whatever way they choose. Strategies like this seem to make fixed value functionally accessible, thus relieving economists of the burden of having to make value choices themselves. I think there is certainly a place for providing alternative results and disaggregating components in this way, but unfortunately it is not a panacea. First, life expectancy is far from the only fixed value choice built into the dailies. There are more than a dozen distinct value choices that are commonly built into dailies, many of which are probably fixed, and plenty more which that are not but have been proposed for consideration. And there exist many different positions on each of these issues. In this paper, I've made it sound like CLE and ALE are two options, but in fact there are many different forms each could take, and indeed the 2010 Global Burden of Disease Study uses a different version of ALE than did earlier studies. It would be impossible to present even a reasonable fraction of the possibilities in a static format, and an online user customizable web tool which inspired to comprehensiveness would be hopelessly complicated. At minimum, presentations like this have to be simplified. The economist will need to fix some value choices and significantly constrain others in order to put the data in a format which will be useful and informative to decision makers. For those value choices, the argument of this paper applies. There is something else. Let's see this. No. There is always the problem of a black box, that when something's user accessible, and like you can say, well, these are the few things that are going on, and you can sort of see what, the choices you make have some sort of have reasonable outcomes. But then if things get complicated, you plug in this data and you get like one thing, and you plug in some other data, you get something completely different. There is a problem in policy that if the policymakers have to be able to explain what they're doing, which usually they do, having a black box behind their decision making is not good for policymakers. So there is a second reason why, like, anything getting more complex is just going to be problematic. Okay, so I would that objection I think has a further. I argue against making overly complex tool to do it, because then the tools get complicated and no one knows exactly how policy is getting made anymore. One of the problems with like artificial intelligence trying to rule the world is it becomes we have no idea what's going on anymore. And we do need to have an idea what's going on. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the scientist's job is not simply to present decision makers with piles of data. It is also to analyze and interpret the results. Okay, this is the black box in some sense. How does the black box work? Even if the online supplement to a scientific paper or policy report includes a spreadsheet which allows users to recalculate results under a range of different value choices, the scientist still needs to choose one or perhaps two or three versions of the result to be the subject of her analysis and discussion. And as much as we might want decision makers to be sophisticated and patient enough to dig through the details of a study to identify methodological choices the scientist made, or at least to scour the online appendix to identify an appropriate set of alternative results. Whoa, what's this music? Getting like funk. Hold on one sec. Yeah, let me go try something. I don't want to get, you get like, what's it called? You get a copyright strikes on your accounts, which I don't have anything bad, but like you don't want your account to get banned. So, try something different. Where were we? As much as we want decision makers to be sophisticated and patient to dig through details of a study to identify methodological choices the scientists made, or at least to scour the online appendix to identify an appropriate set of alternative results, we know that this is not always or even usually the case. For better or worse, it is a scientist's top line or primary result that will garner the bulk of most decision makers' attention. And so even if the global burden of disease study published dailies using 4 different conceptions of life expectancy, whichever was chosen as the primary calculation would, in all likelihood, be the one upon which most associated policy decisions were made. And so this choice matters. There's been studies that show that if stuff is put in a list form, like, people only care about like the top 2 or 3. It's also like they know this also through like Google search results. No one goes to page 2. So even if like there's all the ones in like the top 20 are almost exactly identical to the first one, people will overly select the first few items and discount the rest, even if like the top 20 are all good choices or have slightly different things. So the way data is presented makes a big difference here, and this sort of thing makes a big difference. Okay. Extending the argument. My argument has proceeded primarily via a case study concerning value choices which structure the daily. I chose that study in part because the version of the intermediate view I was considering, according to which values should structure a measure if and only if they are widely held and substantively reasonable, came from Christopher Murray, one of the original architects of the daily. But I don't think anything I said is specific to Murray's view, to the daily, or to health economics as a field. Murray's view reflects, I think, the implicit practice of many economists in a range of subdisciplines who are often not averse to building in uncontroversial value choices, but who refrain from building in controversial ones unless absolutely necessary. And the distinction between user-accessible and fixed value choices is certainly applicable far beyond the daily. Any complex summary measure has the potential to include fixed value choices, but by definition, information is lost in moving from raw data to summary measure, and so any value choice which can only be applied to the raw data will run the risk of being a fixed value choice. For these reasons, I think the principle I proposed in the previous section, according to which there is strong reason for an economist to structure measures to reflect preferred positions on fixed value choices, even if there is great disagreement about that value or significant uncertainty about the correct view of that value, applies to economic measures widely. That distinction actually is it's important in other places too. What is more black boxy, where you just have to decide at the beginning, and then what can be adjusted afterwards. Yeah, there's there's like a family of things like that distinction. I'd have to think about it more though, but it's an important sort of it's an important distinction more generally, I think, too. Nothing I've said, however, suggests that Murray's criteria were irrelevant, just that they were sometimes outweighed by a third factor. Indeed, I agree with Murray that, all else equal, that a value choice is widely held should count in favor of incorporating it into economic measures, and that a value can be supported with good normative reasoning also counts in favor of incorporating it into economic measures. Further, nothing I've said implies that the principle I propose, combined with Murray's, will yield a satisfactory version of the intermediate view. I don't think it does. I suspect there are several additional factors that economists ought to consider when deciding how to structure their measures, and I have said very little about how to handle cases in which the various criteria conflict with one another. As a result, I don't take myself to have come close to answering the question posed in the title of this paper. I hope, though, to have shown that the intermediate view is more attractive than either maximalism or minimalism about values and economic measures, and that finding a plausible version of the intermediate view is a challenging task, one which will result in an account more complex and nuanced than Murray's, and which will call for change in standard economic practices. Yeah, I think, there's more of a normative principle is that for all of these sort of scientific measures that are going to policymakers, you have to find ways to make everything non-fixed and more user accessible. Like, that is what I was thinking earlier. Finding ways to make things, pulling out the complexity and making it into a user accessible version matters in like computer scientists. Like, if you're dealing with like computer stuff, how do you not have a black box there, but you make it so that you understand what is going on in a complex system? That's basically, there's a principle there that needs to be more generally recognized, I think. That the difference between the accessible and non-accessible requires that we should try to find ways to build things in the accessible way, if possible, and understand why we can't when we can't. Yeah. a concrete recommendation, egalitarian values, and summary of measures of health. Fortunately, however, I don't think we need to wait until we have found a fully satisfactory version of the intermediate view to make some concrete recommendations, so let me conclude this paper by offering one. There is widespread agreement that when it comes to health, distribution matters. Our goal should not simply be to maximize total or average population health. We should prefer a more equal distribution of health, even if that comes at the cost of the total or average. Though this preference can take many different forms, for example, egalitarianism, prioritarian, or sufficientarian, call any view which in practice will tend to give additional weight to improving health among the disadvantaged, and egalitarian view. For decades, health economists have discussed how QALYs and dailies could be adjusted to reflect egalitarian values. To date, however, it remains rare to see a major health economic study that includes preference for equality in QALY or dailies. What is the reason for this, given that the architect of the daily in particular have obviously not shied away from building many value judgments into that measure? It is because inequality is complex. As has been amply demonstrated, there are many different senses in which a distribution can be more or less equal, and many of these senses are plausibly of moral importance. As a result, no single way of quantifying egalitarian values has gained general acceptance. Since economists have not known how to capture egalitarian values, they have understandably refrained from doing so. In terms of Murray's version of the intermediate view, there is no specific conception of inequality which is widely accepted or uncontroversial. Note, however, that egalitarian values will generally qualify as fixed values choices in QALYs or dailies. To introduce distribution sensitivity to distribution insensitive QALYs or dailies will require access to the disaggregated raw data, and depending on one's conception of inequality, may also require additional information, for example, the socioeconomic status of each individual with an adverse health outcome. It seems unlikely that decision makers will be able to readily estimate this information from the summary statistics. This suggests, I think, that health economists should seriously consider adjusting QALY and daily-based analyses, including cost-effectiveness analyses, to reflect egalitarian values, despite the fact that there are many different ways of doing so, none of which has received general acceptance. How should economists go about choosing a single metric for inequalities in the face of such disagreement? As above, that goes beyond the scope of this paper. But briefly, it seems to me that a satisfactory solution will require input from a wide range of groups: economists, epidemiologists, health policymakers, philosophers, political theorists, and especially the public. Perhaps a working group could arrive at a consensus, or failing that, at least a strong plurality, on a conception of inequality which they all regard as sufficiently close to their own view to be substantially preferable to distribution neutrality. To address concerns about comparability, distribution sensitivity results could be presented alongside traditional distribution neutral results, though I think the above considerations suggest that the distribution sensitive results should probably be presented as the primary or main ones. The status quo, according to which QALYs and dailies are presented in distribution insensitive ways, has likely led to policymakers to make decisions in ways that embodies distribution insensitive values, even if the policymakers themselves hold egalitarian views. If, as public discourse suggests, most of us hold egalitarian values when it comes to health, this is a problem, and if egalitarian values count as fixed in QALYs and dailies, a problem that can't reasonably be attributed to or corrected by policymakers alone. Yep. So reading some political philosophy not long ago about how liberal conceptions of like free speech were basically hampering feminist politics. And the thing was that free speech was this sort of egalitarian, not egalitarian, it was a distribution in sense of everybody gets free speech all the time in the U.S. And it was causing problems because some speech was hurtful to minority groups. But for the free speech people were, that it's a completely insensitive measure, just freedom of speech. You get freedom of speech here in the U.S. So this is definitely one of these things where the insensitivity of certain ways, the way free speech is distributed, which is universally here, really made a big difference in other areas. So this is, yeah. I don't know, they were battling it out over what sort of policies were allowed, what laws were going to be made. All right, so I mean, this is a nice paper on. I really do like the principles that were introduced here. Let's see. One suggestion I would make is that if you've got nice principles, you should at least give them a name. Like this, you've just got 2 bullet points. And so without naming your principles here, it's just going to be, what were the principles called, man? It's just the bullet point principles. Okay, it's okay, but besides my rhetorical problems on the way the paper was written, no major beefs. I think I had a few comments along the way. But nice paper overall, and thanks for listening. Have a good day. Stay safe, everybody.